Hello and welcome back to Reading Through Mark. We are in chapter 2. Today we are starting at verse 13, the calling of Levi. So let's begin reading right away. Once again, Jesus went out beside the lake. A large crowd came to him, and he began to teach them. As he walked along, he saw Levi, son of Alphaeus, sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," Jesus told him. And Levi got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Levi's house, many tax collectors and sinners were eating with him and his disciples, for there were many who followed him. When the teachers of the law, who were Pharisees, saw him eating with the sinners and tax collectors, he asked his disciples, "Why does he eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said to them, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Here's a big thing that we really need to realize today. This is in particular a temptation for people that are regularly in church, people that are regularly in their scriptures and things. However, this is also you also see this temptation for people that want nothing to do with church. Self-righteousness is an issue for all of us, and that's exactly the thing. Self-righteousness, seeing myself as a good person, that I am right because of who I am and what I do. This is an evil thing, spiritually speaking. It is evil because it leads us to unjustly judge other people around us. It fills us up with pride. And so this is what we see from these Pharisees in this particular account. Jesus calls a tax collector, Levi, also called Matthew elsewhere, to follow him. And again, let's think through what exactly that entails, right? Tax collectors back in this day were seen as horribly immoral people for a number of reasons. During Jesus' lifetime, the Roman Empire had conquered Israel, and so they had authority over the Israelites. And the Israelites really would rather have ruled themselves, okay? So the Jewish people wanted to be their own government. They didn't want to have this other nation ruling them and imposing their laws and rules on them. And one of those laws and rules imposed on the Jewish people was taxes. They had to pay taxes to the Romans. And so, in order to collect those taxes, the Romans hired sometimes Jewish people to collect those taxes. And so think about how those people, those tax collectors, were then looked at by the other Jews, right? The tax collectors had abandoned their own people, okay? So they were traitors to their fellow Jewish people, and now they were bringing these taxes to these foreign rulers that were over their nation. So they were seen as traitors to the Jewish nation. In addition to that, very often, essentially how it would work is that the Romans would tell the tax collectors, okay, you are to collect this much money and bring that all to us. But then the tax collector could go to an individual taxpayer and say, you owe me a little bit more than I was asked to collect. And again, there was no real legal recourse against that. So many tax collectors would get quite greedy with this. They would take way more from their fellow man than they were supposed to. So they were seen as horribly greedy. They were incredibly wealthy because of this cheating they were doing to their fellow Israelites. They were seen as traitors, right? And so they were really seen as kind of the scum of society, right? They were really looked down upon as just absolutely horrible people. And in a lot of cases, they were. They were quite horrible people. And so for Jesus to spend time with them and even to call one of them to be one of the 12 disciples, this was shocking, especially to the religious elites back in that day, right? And Jesus, though, sets the tone here. He helps us to realize why is here, right? He gives this picture of a doctor. The healthy person doesn't need a doctor. The sick person does. In the same way, spiritually, Jesus spends time with the moral scum of society because he's showing people in a tangible way that he is here to call sinners. The reality is, every single one of us are sinners. The question is, do you realize how sinful you are, right? We naturally say, well, I'm at least one of the good ones, right? we naturally want to define ourselves as one of the good ones. And so we always, when we define a good person, we always set the bar just about right where we are, right? Or some people set it as low as they possibly can. It's like, as long as you're not a serial killer, you're a good person. But again, what exactly makes you a good person? Elsewhere, we see in the Gospels, Jesus says, no, if you want to set the bar for what a good person is, you have to put that bar all the way up at who God is, how good God is. And if you don't measure up to God, then you're not a good person, right? And so this is something for us to reframe how we think about morality in the world around us. And Jesus really goes a long way to help us with this. And again, the more I recognize how immoral I actually am, that is going to create in me a mercy just like Jesus, right? That is going to create in me a mercy that, okay, this person society might say that I'm better than them, but Jesus died for their sins just as he died for my sins. And so I want to be kind. I want to be merciful to that person, right? I want to recognize from God's law just how sick I am, and that I am in desperate need of the doctor, of the Savior Jesus. And the more I realize that, the more I'm going to grow in humility, the more I'm going to grow in showing mercy to those around me, rather than sitting in judgment and pride over everybody else, right? And so Jesus eating with tax collectors and sinners, that's a huge deal for us to really think about today, especially in our churches, right? Are we at church condemning people that aren't as good as we are, at least in our own minds, or are we actually willing to welcome sinners like Jesus did, right? That's something for us to think through. All right, let's continue on. We are in Mark chapter 2, verse 18. Now, John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. Some people came and asked Jesus, how is it that John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees are fasting, but yours are not? Jesus answered, how can the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? They cannot, so long as they have him with them. But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them, and on that day they will fast. No one sews a patch of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the new piece will pull away from the old, making the tear worse. And no one pours new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and both the wine and the wineskins will be ruined. No, he pours new wine into new wine skins. Here again, we have Jesus butting heads a little bit with the Pharisees, and this whole talk of new cloth and old cloth, new wineskins, new wine, right? All these things. What Jesus is getting at here is that with his picture, right? If you've got, in both of these cases, if you try to put this new thing onto something old, it's going to burst. It's going to rip. It's going to tear. It's not going to work. And so in the same way, these teachings that Jesus is bringing, the gospel patch, is not going to fit on the cloth practices of how the religious leaders at that time were trying to do things, right? So again, in order for us to understand Jesus, he's not going to fit into the box that we want to put him, right? By what our culture teaches us about these things. We have to put those things aside to learn from what Jesus is saying. Jesus came to fulfill all the Old Testament, but because of all these extra man-made rules added on top of what the scriptures actually said, the Jews were not going to be able to understand Jesus according to those man-made practices. Let's continue on to finish off the chapter here. We're at verse 23. One Sabbath, Jesus was going through the grain fields, and his disciples walked along, and as his disciples walked along, they began to pick some heads of grain. The Pharisees said to him, "Look, why are they doing what is unlawful on the Sabbath?" He answered, "Have you never read what David did when he and his companions were hungry and in need? In the days of Abiathar, the high priest, he entered the house of God and ate the consecrated bread, which is lawful only for the priests to eat, and he also gave some to his companions. Then he said to them, 'The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath.'" This is a fascinating section right here. Jesus, again and again throughout the Gospels, is butting heads with the religious leaders specifically because of how he was treating the Sabbath. The Jews in that day had some very strict laws and rules on what was allowed to happen on the Sabbath. Remember, that word Sabbath means rest. In the Old Testament times, the Sabbath day is a Saturday, right? Christians began worshiping God not on Saturday, that day of rest, but instead worshiping on Sunday, having Sunday be that day of rest, because Jesus rose from the dead on Sunday. However, the Old Testament rules and regulations that back then they weren't allowed to do any work. And again, this is why there were so many rules added on top of the Sabbath, because they were trying to put a fence around God's word to make sure that we're not doing any kind of work. They wanted to really define that very clearly, but God had not defined that very clearly. And so that's where the abuses came in, where they tried to be very specific where God had been very general. But here, Jesus points to something that's actually kind of disturbing, some very troubling things, especially if you're going to be like really hyper literal or hyper conservative on some of these things. Jesus points out something that David did back in his day, that he actually ate this bread that was only lawful for the priests to eat. And so again, according to the letter of the law, this was a big no-no, but David did it. And but David did that because it fulfilled the higher law of God that had been revealed to him, that he needed to live so that he could be the king that God had promised he would be, right? And so this is one of those things where we do have to kind of wrestle with certain moral principles sometimes. There are certain cases where it's difficult. Which is the better thing for me to do? It seems like both things I'm going to do are going to be violating a law of God. One clear example, again from the scriptures, is back in the book of Exodus, where the king, Pharaoh commanded the midwives of the Israelites to kill any young boys that were born to the Israelites. But the midwives didn't do this. They disobeyed an order from their government, from their God-given authority, and they also lied to that government. So did they do wrong? Well, no, because God also wants us to protect life, right? And that protection of life was far more important than obedience to an immoral command and being honest with that immoral government. And so in that case, God actually commends what the midwives did. So there are these balances that need to be made, because life can be very chaotic sometimes. Life can be very complicated at times. And so it's a place for us to recognize what is that higher law of God. Again, this is something to wrestle with as a Christian. All right, I think that's all for now. God's richest blessings on you all until we meet again.
And I say, can't be that easy. And he said, and no, it wasn't easy, but be still.